This is the first of three Sussex Centre public lectures for this semester. For a variety of reasons, we delayed our first one, partly because we wanted to spare you the unpleasant experience of coming out on a January or February evening. Actually, we delayed it till now, and we couldn't really have done better. It's a beautiful evening, especially since we have to be looking at some dark matters. I want to introduce this evening Willem de Blécourt, who is a historical anthropologist and an independent researcher who specialises in the study of witchcraft and folk magic in 18th century Europe and before. Willem studied anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. He also spent some crucial years in the city of Edinburgh in about 1975, which has shaped his, he saw Bill Connolly then, that shaped his whole perspective, I think. Willem has written extensively on magical and alternative practices in European culture. He's an honorary research fellow of the Mertens Institute Amsterdam and also of the Huizinga Institute Amsterdam. Huizinga is a name to be reckoned with. You put a play around the tongue.
You pronounce him Huizinga.
Huizinga. Huizinga. We were talking about the last meeting in Dutch. Huizinga.
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 Yeah.
The Latin bit is either homo deus. Willem's books include cultural approaches to the history of medicine, Beyond the Witch Trials, Witchcraft and Magic in Enlightenment Europe. Both of that's what Manchester University Press. Witchcraft Continued, Popular Magic in Modern Europe, Tales of Magic Told in Print. That is his latest book, Beyond Shot, is going to be quite an important controversial book, I think. So remember that title, Tales of Magic, Tales in Print. It delights me to introduce to you this evening, Willem de Blécourt. Very much.
Thank you. I have a choice. I can either keep my glasses on and look at you, or take them off and read my text. I can't do both at the same time. I suppose you want to hear my text. I'm very honoured to be given the opportunity to speak at the Centre for Folklore, Fairy Tales and Fantasy. As a historical anthropologist with a geographical predilection for Europe, folklore, whatever that may be, is one of my major areas of expertise. Tonight, however, I will primarily address the relation between fantasy, that is to say, in some of its cinematic manifestations, and fairy tales. Or to be more precise, the relation between witches on screen and those in fairy tales. Such an undertaking is, by definition, historical. At least I am incapable and unwilling to approach it otherwise. I also have to admit that the relation between screen witches and fairy tale witches turned out not to be as straightforward as I thought it would be, at least not when their images are concerned. The reports folklorists have collected about everyday life accusations of witchcraft will mainly offer a contrasted perspective. One last introductory remark. What you will be going to hear and see is very much a work in progress. I'm new to film studies and I have my own way of looking at the screen. I'm also in the middle of this project and I look forward to your comments and questions afterwards. So let me start with a simple question. How are witches imagined? I will not confront you with a definition of witchcraft and then proceed to show how various screen witches do or do not fit in it. Such would be, in my view, academic pigeonholing and may turn out to be counterproductive. Instead, I will give you an example. In one of the early episodes of the American television series Bewitched, with the title The Witches Are Out, and first aired on the 29th of October 1964, marked the date, the female protagonist, Samantha, played by Elizabeth Montgomery, is having tea with her 3 aunts. And look at the floating teacup here. And these are the aunts. Samantha is a young, blonde, beautiful, and actually also clever housewife, while her aunts appear elderly. They are all witches. They discuss the way witches are depicted at Halloween. Aunt Mary remarks, "It's not the broomsticks I mind so much. It's the way they make us look. Those ugly, horrid warts and those long, crooked noses." Whereupon Samantha replies, "I guess they just don't realize that we're like anybody else. Almost." And our Aunt Bertha, who in season 3 would be rebaptized as Agatha, suggests someone ought to rewrite those fairy tales. Well, you know, show Hansel and Gretel for what they really are. A couple of pushy kids going around eating sweet old ladies' houses. At the same time, Samantha's husband, Darren, an advertising executive, and at that point played by Dick York, is meeting a client, Mr. Brinkman, who has a very firm idea of how he wants to visualize the campaign for his sweets. And this is how he expresses it. An ugly old crone with a long nose, I mean long, and then warts on her chin and broken teeth. A whole mouthful of broken teeth, and a tall black hat and a broomstick. A potential conflict is born, for Samantha has suggested her aunts to ask Darren to help them to counteract the negative, degrading witch image. When Darren comes home, Samantha's aunts have excited through the wall, apart from Aunt Clara, who bumped into it, and Darren proceeds to visualize his client's wishes. That's what he's doing there. Samantha sees and becomes upset, and then the following dialogue ensues. Samantha, "Why did you do it?" Darren, "Because that's the way most people think witches look." Samantha, "Is that any reason to discriminate against a minority group?" Darren, "What minority group?" "Witches, of course." Sam, "People don't believe in witches." Samantha, "What's that got to do with anything?" Darren, "How can you discriminate against something you don't know exists?" And Samantha retorts, "Don't split hairs." In the end, Samantha manages to convince Darren that each Halloween she had horrible experiences when she and her mother had to escape the country to avoid the onslaught of the wretched witch images. The next day, in his office, Darren has more trouble persuading his client and his boss. He has drawn an alternative, more sexy image, but they are not so easily swayed. When Darren mentions witches to his boss, the latter responds, "Witches? You mean with long noses, blacked out teeth and warts?" "No, of course not. They probably look more like..." And Darren thinks for a moment here. Obviously, he does not want to mention his wife. They probably look more like Glinda. The boss and the client both. "Who?" Darren. "Glinda, the good witch of the north in the Wizard of Oz. Oh, she's gorgeous." "The good witch of the north?" And the client. He doesn't want to hurt her feelings. Samantha and her aunts then decide to take action. They form a picket line in Brinkman's bedroom, or in his dream, explain that they are witches and do not look as he thinks they should. To underline their arguments, they change Brinkman's face into that of the kind of witch he imagines. Not just with the long nose and warts, but also green. That helps. The next day, he decides to choose Darren's design of scanty-clad young witch with the text. You can just read it there. "Only the choosest witches eat witches' brew candy." This lands in a big increase in sales because it turned out that men, not women or children, bought most of the sweets. Although on the surface, Samantha appears to be a housewife who mainly stays within the domestic space to do the cleaning and the cooking while her husband goes out to work, over the course of the series it becomes clear enough that she who wields the power. Darren may have asked her not to exercise any of her craft, which he does so with the twitching of her upper lip, but there's always reasons to make an exception. And often Darren falls victim to the wiles of his in-laws, which also changes to a kid, an old man, an old woman, an ape, a werewolf, and even into his boss. The show, Bewitched, emphasizes that to live in suburbia is actually impossible without a little witchcraft now and then. That is to say, the power to manipulate inanimate objects and living beings, and of instant transportation. Now, while it would certainly be possible to analyze the episode I just discussed, as well as others, in terms of its plot structure and script writing, it also offers a good introduction to the prevailing witch images of 1960s America. In the first place, a witch is unnoticeable, that is to say, indistinguishable from everybody else. But when she takes on her witch aspects, she is equipped with a robe, a hat, and a broom. A few episodes later, this one, when Darren imagines how their children would look like, they may have shed to nose, warts, and faulty denture, but they still fly around on broomsticks and wear a black cape and a pointed hat. Again later, when Samantha has to prove to Michael, a boy who stays overnight with them for Christmas, that she's really a witch, her robe is not sufficient, and she has to add the hat as well as the broom. Such is also the appearance of the cartoonized witch icon with which each episode opens. However, the evil witch is not entirely absent. She is manifested as Samantha's mother Endora, very clear one, although primarily in her relation to husband Darren. To him, witch becomes synonym with mother-in-law. The image I've called the unnoticeable witch is actually very close to the historical everyday life witch. At least within Europe, and by extension the American colonies, people operating in what I call the witchcraft discourse did not know what a witch looked like. Anyone could be a witch, and the available rituals, this is one of them, functioned to discover the proper witch. For according to the rules of the discourse, only the one who had inflicted the bewitchment could undo it. Well, what you see here, it's a black chicken that is to be cooked. And the idea was, if you do that inside the house, you close off all the openings, then the witch who caused all the trouble in your house would knock on the door, you could grab her and then force her to unwitch everything. So the whole idea that only the one who had inflicted the bewitchment could also undo it also occurs in a weakened form in Bewitched. It's to say, a spell can only be undone when its exact wordings are known, and often only by the person who cast it. The unwitchment rituals are documented, sometimes even depicted. It's not a witch, this is a woman who is either herself bewitched or her children or grandchildren. And she's sitting next to a cunning man. And what the cunning man is actually showing her the picture of the witch in this bucket of water. And what she needs to do then is put, it should be a knife, put it in the water and she will wound the witch in that way. There are no pictures of actual witches, only pictures of unwitchment rituals. In everyday life, the witch herself existed only by way of ascription. Someone said that so and so was a witch, and it depended on how convincing the argument was, whether the label stuck, and that particular person was consequently treated as a witch, that is to say, subjected to violence and or to ostracism. From this perspective, Samantha and her relatives only operate within a very particular witchcraft discourse, in this case, the one of the television show. It saves them from attacks within the series and, at least in the 1960s and early 70s, mostly also from outside them. So there were no fundamentalist Christians around at that time in the States who protested like they later did in the case of Harry Potter. At the time, in the 60s, the show could easily raise a number of issues, and more easily than other shows, because it was only about witchcraft. Within the show's universe, witches are occasionally exposed, but the usual way to counteract exposure is to keep it restricted to one person, in particular Samantha's neighbor Gladys, who's then declared insane. When halfway the show's 8 seasons, Darren has become so desperate of all the witchcraft around him that he gives up his struggle to contain it and wants to tell the world. Samantha shows him in a dream what's not happening. They will either be put on display, persecuted, or used for military or commercial purposes. Bewitched presented a blueprint for the plot of the more recent Harry Potter books and films. Joanna Rowling was certainly inspired by the Bewitched universe, for a considerable number of similar concepts can be identified. First and foremost, the congruence between what I called mortals in the television show and muggles in the Harry Potter books and film, and the contempt that some of the witches harbor towards these muggles or mortals. The television shows also refers to its predecessors, The Wizard of Oz and Hansel and Gretel. And film historians will immediately point to 2 earlier American films with informed Bewitched. I Married a Witch of 1942 and Bell, Book and Candle of 1958. It is usually overlooked that the crux of the Bewitched series, the witchcraft practicing wife versus the husband who does not want to have anything to do with it, was not the theme of those 2 films, I Married a Witch and Bell and Candle, but of the British films Night of the Eagle of 1962, that came out just before Bewitched started, released in the USA as Burn, Witch, Burn. From the point of view of other screen representations of witches, Bewitched is not just synchronically representational, it's also diachronically pivotal. Of course, with more than 250 episodes, Bewitched had much more space to try out various concepts than a single film or even a sequence of 8 films. Both Bell, Book and Candle and I Married a Witch deal with courtship between witch and non-witch. Night of the Eagle, on the other hand, is much more about university politics, and since the husband has destroyed all his wife's witchcraft paraphernalia, which he here disposed on the table, in the beginning of the film, most of the action is taken up by his attempts to save his wife. Bell, Book and Candle exhibits a subtle and stylish imagery. Its main witch, Gillian, King Novak, is an independent woman who runs her own shop with primitive art. She studied anthropology. Witches look like everybody else, are unnoticeable, only they are incapable of blushing or crying. Although the title of the previous I Married a Witch only covers the tail end of the film and would, like Bell, Book and Candle, more appropriately have been named How I Was Snatched Away by a Witch on My Wedding Day, the witch Jennifer is likewise young and beautiful. For the iconography, however, the promotional pictures are much more revealing than the film itself. In the former, the actress, Veronica Lake, appears with exposed legs and a witch's hat. Very much like in Darren's drawings. The pumpkins on the background expose the Halloween connection. On one picture, she even rides a broomstick. Oh. Yeah, that's much more difficult to see. In the film, she's fully clad, doesn't wear a pointed hat, and only rides a broomstick in non-corporeal form. I Married a Witch was based on the unfinished manuscript The Passionate Witch by Thorne Smith, who may very well have read the Oz books by Al Frank Baum. The 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz, is a quest story in which the main characters are all looking for their heart's desire. The Scarecrow for a brain, the Tin Man for a heart, the Lion for courage, and the female lead Dorothy for home. In this, they are aided by a good witch and obstructed by a bad one. The film has, so the American historian Carol Carlson, quote, done more than any single witch to shape the popular stereotype in this country. As a film historian observed, anyone who grew up in the US has likely watched Wizard on television numerous times, as it was aired yearly beginning in 1956. According to Carlson, the witch in Oz has two forms. In her earthly form, she resembles the most negative recent depictions of New England witches. Angry, aggressive, contentious, and vindictive. She is given to unreasonable provocation of decent folk who live around her, even innocent children, and shows callous indifference to the most basic human values. In her supernatural form, she is murderous. In the film, the transition is made visible when Dorothy is transported from Kansas to Oz, farmhouse and all, by cyclone, and things and people pass a window, which at that point functions as a film screen within the film. Her neighbor, Miss Gulch, is first seen on a bike, here, but then the bike changes into a broomstick and the neighbor into a witch. The dual nature of the witch, natural and supernatural, is mirrored in the other main characters of the film, with a few notable exceptions where it concerns other women. The man who inhabits Dorothy's world in Kansas also accompanied her in the land of Oz. The Wicked Witch will have bestowed her green face on subsequent witches, especially the Halloween ones, but she did not have any warts or missing teeth. These derived from Oz's cinematic predecessor and competitor, Walt Disney's Snow White of 1937. Now, in the film The Wizard of Oz, the wicked witches are contrasted by the good witch Glinda, who actually looks more like a fairy. Actually, her sleeves, not her wings, but still. When Dorothy has just landed in Oz, and more specifically in Munchkin country, accidentally killing the wicked witch of the East, Glinda welcomes her. Glinda What the Munchkins want to know is, are you a good witch or a bad witch? Dorothy, but I've already told you, I'm not a witch at all. Witches are old and ugly. What was that? Glinda. The Munchkins, they're laughing because I'm a witch. I'm Glinda, the good witch of the north. Go on. I beg your pardon, but I've never heard of a beautiful witch before. And Glinda says, only bad witches are ugly. The film of 1939 was not just a cinematographic version of Baum's book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz of 1900. In between, the material was performed many times. On stage as a musical since 1902, as a so-called fairy-log combination of slides, narration and pieces of film in 1908 and 1909, as a silent film in 1910. Let me get a sharper picture of it. Which? And also in 1925, another film. And in the late 1920s, there were theatre performances for children and even a marionette version. An animated film appeared in 1933 and a radio show later that year. In all these different manifestations of the story, the presence of the wicked witch fluctuated. While part of the book, she was written out of the musical, made a comeback in the 1910 film as Momba the Witch, and disappeared again from the 1925 film. Momba actually was just a different name for the Witch of the West, derived from the sorceress Mombi in Baum's The Marvelous Lands of Oz of 1904. By then, Baum had switched. This is actually Glinda in the 1910 film, who pretty much looks like a phrase. He even has a wand somewhere. And I presented that. By 1904, Baum, let's do that too, had switched his original illustrator, William Wallace Denslow, Witch of the East, called John Neal. That's Neal's witch. Yet the film, 1910 film I have to say, like the musical, was mostly based on Denslow's design. In his turn, L. Frank Baum, who was an actor and something of a jack of all trades before he found his calling as a writer of children's books, was influenced by mother-in-law Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Her 1983 book, going further back in time, Woman, Church and State, was, and I quote, an early classic of reimagined women's history, written in a tearing hurry and in time snatched from a political activism which left no space for original research. Gage linked the romantic witches of the French historian Jules Michelet with matriarchal society. To Gage, they became pagan priestesses who had preserved the secrets of that golden age, especially in the realm of healing, and were persecuted by churchmen not just to wipe out their religion, but to complete the breaking of any spirit of female independence. This is the view of Gage, not necessarily that of any historian. As the Oz books were mostly set in fantasy lands, the ideology became even more radical, with mostly female rulers. As historian Marion Gibson concluded, Brown's witches had almost overnight become liberal metaphors for political dissent and female self-empowerment. That, of course, only applied to good witches. Let's go with that witch. It has been argued that Dorothy's wish to return home to Kansas inhibits her status as a prototypical feminist. That is certainly the case in the film, when one of the scriptwriters was instructed to that very extent. Nevertheless, even within the film, it creates a dilemma, as dull sepia-toned Kansas is set against colourful Oz. And Dorothy has expressed very vocally in the beginning of the film that she longs for a place over the rainbow. As Salman Rushdie expressed it, are we to believe that Dorothy has learned no more on her journey than that she didn't need to make such a journey in the first place? Must we accept that she now accepts the limitations of her home life and agrees that the things she does not have there are no loss to her? Is that right? Well, excuse me, Glinda, but it's hell. That was Salman Rushdie. In the 14-tome Oz series of books, however, Dorothy kept returning to Oz and eventually brought her adoptive parents with her. Even if the influence of the film will have been greater than the book, since the vast majority of those who come to Oz come to it long before they encounter the book, then the domestication of Dorothy will still have been counteracted within the film. The film nevertheless contributed to the witch image. Brinkman's face in Bewitched can be seen as an indication for that, as is the mention of Glinda. Yet Halloween witches dressed up as Glinda are as rare as they are in films or television series, or unrecognizable because taken for fairies or princesses. So the question is, did the depiction of the good witch then pave the way for the unnoticeable witch? That is questionable in as far as the role of the highly visible Glinda is restricted to Oz, and without any US equivalent. At least the unnoticeable witch offered an alternative to the good witch. So Neil's illustrations, those two, of Oz were closely related to those of the fairy tales which had inspired Bam. This is even visible in the film. For instance, when a shot of the Wicked Witch of the West is compared with an illustration by Arthur Rackham. Just the other way around, but a similar composition of witch tree girl. An illustration by Arthur Rackham for a story in the English fairy tales. I will therefore take yet another step back into history and briefly dwell with two fairy tales. Generally, it concerns a printed tradition here, from which witches were mainly absent. Italian 17th century stories featured the opposition of fairies and ogresses, which in the late 17th century France became fairies and evil fairies. Only in early 19th century Germany, the evil fairies were transformed into witches. Hansel and Gretel contains, without doubt, one of the most well-known of today's fairy tale witches. Its popularity was enhanced by the German composer Engelbert Humperdinck, who in the late 1800s turned the story into an opera, which is still performed today. Yet the story of Hansel and Gretel itself of course later than the one I showed before. The story of Hansel and Gretel itself is no older than the early 19th century. It's actually a drawing by what they call the other Grimm brother. Ludwig was a brother of Jacob Grimm. He made it in the 1820s. Which Gretel and Hansel behind bars there. In the early 19th century, the story of Hansel and Gretel was put together out of existing story parts by Marie Hassenflug with a little help from George King Wiet. Both women were teenagers at the time and friends of the brothers Grimm. The parts they used for Hansel and Gretel mostly derived from the cluster of stories that is known as the Magic Flight. Among others, Madame d'Aulnoy, L'Orange et la Baie, the Orange Tree and the Bee. In the Magic Flight stories, the boy and the girl are not brother and sisters, they are lovers, and the girl has magical power too, like the mother, the witch. The early 19th century version was infantilized. The history of Hansel and Gretel can easily be the subject of a completely separate talk, as can be the tracing of its 19th century popularity all over Europe. What is important to stress here is that its witch did not have any relation to everyday life witches. Nor, by the way, does the theme of abandoned children in fairy tale contribute anything to social history. In The Two Brothers, another story in the Kingdom of Hauswitch by the brothers Grimm, the witch only appears at the end. One brother has conquered the dragon and lives happily ever after with his princess, when at one evening he sees a light in the distance. He has to investigate and falls into the clutches of an old witch who turns him into stone. This is one of the stories that the suppliers of the Grimms took from the Italian collection of Giambattista Basile, Lo Conto degli Conti, better known as the Pentameron, and they adapted it slightly. For in Basile's Lo Mercante, the merchant, the hero Cienzo, instead of spotting a witch, sees a beautiful young woman who can ensorcel men with her hair. He falls for her and has to be liberated by his brother Mio. That is a much more sensible plot, and it reveals that the transition from seductive enchantress to evil witch has to be located in early 19th century Germany. It's also impossible that it could have been an oral tradition. Genuine witchcraft narratives, on the other hand, circulating in oral tradition, gave people advice how to act, where to go, what to do, and who to avoid. This again is a bewitchment ritual instead of here done by a priest. These stories are still very much present in the 20th century, and they come not only by the thousands, if you know where to look, they also appear in several guises which have different relations to perceived bewitchment. Yet, all these witchcraft stories do tap into a set of concepts passed from mouth to mouth and from generation to generation. It is, however, impossible to conclude the same when it comes to fairy tales. Witches in oral tradition are usually neighbors. They are rumored to bewitch with their touch, their eyes, or their words. Occasionally, they are said to change into animals, into cats or hares, or an array of other species. In fairy tales, on the other hand, witches live in the woods. They do not bewitch, but they change other people into animals, or what we just see, petrify them. Fairy tales do not provide agendas for action. They offer entertainment at the most. The Grimms considered fairy tale figures, which is included as part of a derelict mythology. Jacob's Grimm linking with the witch in Hansel and Gretel to Chichester certainly made sense, as long as it remained in the literary dimension. Beyond this, his view was at least selective. The main ordering principle of Jacob's Deutsche Mythologie, translated in English as Teutonic mythology, is to decontextualize words, and the juxtaposition of similar words resulted in associative conceptual strings. In such a construction, the medieval witch evolved out of a combination of goddesses, priestesses, swan maidens, and Valkyrie. Fantasy, I quote Grimm here, tradition, knowledge of remedies, poverty and spinsterhood made women into witches. With different emphasis, the echo of this view reverberated for over a century. It surfaced, among others, in Gates's work, the mother-in-law of Baum, and is still popular among the general public and self-proclaimed pagans. Among historians, it's certainly not taken seriously anymore. But if the witches in the fairy tales were fairly new, does that also apply to the way they were represented? The iconography of Hansel and Gretel is of little help here. The only conclusion that can be drawn from it is that it fossilized the witch as an old woman, discarding the notion that the direct ancestor of Gretel was, although still a fairy tale witch, at least a young witch. Witches in fairy tales, however, do not fly, and finding a broomstick among them is difficult. What I did find was a Two Brothers illustration by George Cruikshank. It's an illustration to a translation of a collection by Albert Ludwig Grimm, who is no family of Jacob and Bill. And he shows the witch at least with a golden hat. This Grimm, Albert Ludwig, knew the story because his grandfather had told it to him, together with stories from the Arabian Nights. And Ludwig Grimm, Albert Ludwig Grimm, didn't publish anything from oral tradition that his grandfather told him stories and that his grandfather has found in his own book. Plenty of them around in the 18th century. So, to highlight the various connections between films and between films and films and between films and fairy tales, I've shown the historical sequence backwards. I will now turn it around in proper historical order and start in the later Middle Ages, when books come framework. As it is still the history of today's witch image, with broomstick and pointed hat as in Bewitched, well, that's the broomstick. This implies not just an abbreviated but also a very fragmented history, in which many other developments are largely neglected. It also needs to be kept in mind from the outset that at the time the first ingredients of the current image came into being, it was already very difficult, if not impossible, to legally identify a witch, that is to say, a person who had caused bewitchments and had entered the pact with the devil. No one ever witnessed a flying witch, and the closest people got was the observation of a sleeping woman who was later declared to have been flying, if that was already not just a story. Flying witches also did not figure in an everyday life context. When the notion occurred in a trial, usually in combination with the Sabbath, it was imported through learned demonological tracts. Even among the theorists, the concept of the flight was the most contested. At the same time, the lack of verification served very well to depict witchcraft. When an artist drew a flying witch, he could be certain that his, usually upper-class public, would recognize her. When the image of the witch was on the broomstick was mainly continental. This is mid-15th century Swiss. Since the broom primarily served as a means of transportation to the Sabbath, it was absent in places where the Sabbath concept was not transmitted. But on the continent, flying on a broom was only one way to reach a faraway witch's assembly. Oven floors and animals such as a goat were also used. And when the meetings were nearby, witches simply walked. One of the reasons witch trials stopped was that people in charge of them started to doubt the methods of obtaining proof. While the witchcraft discourse remained in place on an everyday life level, intellectuals embarked on a process of distanciation. Apparently, part of this process, and there's still some research to be done here, included dressing up as a witch and putting her on stage. This is mid-18th century England. This is late 18th century England. This is also mid-18th century England with witches in procession with hats and broomsticks. And you see here too. In this context, and only in England, where witches had hardly been flying at all, the combination of the pointed hat and broomstick first turns up. As Ian Bostridge, yes, that is the singer, in the previous incarnation, wrote, it concerns a fossilized image of the plebeian countrywoman of the late 17th century and a stereotype which has persisted into the children's books of the late 20th century. The tradition will also have continued, whether or not with fluctuation, in masked balls and celebrations which called for dressing up. In the last quarter of the 19th century, it was taken up in Halloween feasts and transported to the USA. Apart from relying on other artists, illustrators, like the one Baum used, fell back on this public tradition. The later film industry, hardly in the forefront of artistic renovation, needed a recognizable witch and opted for the trusted hat and broomstick image. In spite of that, I'll come to that in a moment, various depictions of the screen witch have developed over the 20th and 21st century, first decade of it, coinciding with different genres of film. In this talk, I've left the more recent developments of screen witches out of the picture. The advantage of this is that a more or less coherent theme arises that links the Wizard of Oz to Bewitched, the tension between the domestication of the witch figure on the one hand and her liberative power on the other. Dorothy's magical slippers are mainly meant to bring her home to dull Kansas. In that respect, she falls into the same category as Glinda, and it's just no coincidence that the Wicked Witch and Dorothy have been construed as polar opposites. Jennifer, here, at the end of I Married a Witch, is portrayed as a knitting housewife, her loose hair contained. Her successor in Bellbook and Candle has turned from a seductive femme fatale into a meek florist. Samantha of Bewitched, finally, has turned domestication into a virtue, although she possesses an almost unlimited godlike power. Yet, these observations only seem to apply to the good witches. Are wicked witches beyond domestication? Or do they serve as a warning what will happen to women when they do not subject to the male rule? One of the ways to counteract this is to protest against the image of the wicked witch. The television show Bewitched provided either the paradigm or the particular details for later witchcraft films and television series, especially in the USA. It set the standards. Apart from a not so successful remake in 2005, its influence is clearly visible in, for instance, Teen Witch, which even employed the actor Dick Sargent as the lead character's father. Sargent had replaced York as Darren in the 6th season of Bewitched. In Halloween Town of 1998, a suburban family is portrayed in which the mother tries to live without witchcraft, but is then interrupted by her mother, who entices the children to come into their power. More generally, without Bewitched, the series Sabrina the Teenage Witch would have been unthinkable, and both paved the way for the other show, Charmed, where all things witchcraft were handled differently. In particular, the Bewitched episode, I confess, reverberated in All Hell Breaks Loose, the last episode of season 3 of Charmed. It also, the Bewitched episode, inspired the children's movie Escape to Witch Mountain. It may even be possible to consider George Romero's film Jack's Wife of 1972, also known as Season of the Witch, within the Bewitched parameters. It is all about a housewife who turns to witchcraft to brighten up her life in suburbia. And then there is Harry Potter, which is a chapter on its own. Within the Bewitched series, a number of episodes were remade, and in that sense, Bewitched also quoted itself. The episode I discussed at the beginning of this talk was filmed again in season 6 under the title To Trick or Treat or Not to Trick or Treat, aired on the 30th of October 1969. While crucial lines were kept, the theme of the witch's image is now firmly positioned in the Halloween setting. Samantha and Darren's daughter, Tabitha, originally Tabitha, has become old enough to collect sweets in the neighborhood, and this time everyone also canvasses for UNICEF. Samantha is helping with the costumes, among them some witch costumes with gruesome masks, to which her mother, Dora, takes offense. To prove her point, she puts a spell on Darren, Sergeant, who gradually changes into a Halloween witch, only without the green face. He uses his disguise to collect money and ends up a Halloween hero. As Samantha tells Andorra, do you realize that you have given the witch image that we hate more publicity than that it had since the Salem trials? She then suggested to use an alternative image for an advertising campaign. And the interesting thing is that although she says she's Glinda, she actually looks like herself, which is expert. The message has therefore changed. Even a popular television show should not try to attempt the impossible and alter the existing witch image. It should certainly not try to replace it with one that is degrading to women, at least that's my interpretation, but instead nudge it into the direction of the good witch whose face is like that of the model housewife, almost. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Willem. That was fascinating. I'm sure there will be quite a few questions. Are you okay to take a few questions?
Yeah, please. I may ask you to repeat it when I'm not hearing it properly. But let's try. There's a lot to take in, I'm realizing. How did you think the witch looked like?
What I hark back to when I think about witches is the is it Arthur C. Miller's Salem witch trials, and I always imagined witches in that sort of era as being quite puritanical in appearance, without the tall black hats.
They have put recently a statue of her in Salem. You're aware of that?
I'm written there, no.
Yes, for example. Of course, not the witches herself, the people who accuse them. But that's something I would actually say completely different. these are historical witches in a very specific late 17th century USA colonial context. They had a big problem, and the most interesting thing of Salem is that you find a whole pile of studies about them. They're all different. Wonderful to use for teaching, do a whole course on Salem. The interesting of Salem is that it has turned into a whole witch industry. There's a museum there at the moment. I haven't been there because hearsay. But more, you find in a lot of American television shows, films, when there's any historical reference, it's to Salem. So I'm trying to tell American historians, please look around, and there must have been other trials than just Salem, and other material. And some people are looking into it, but hardly. But again, that's a different subject.
Were the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth depicted, and were they drawn at all?
It's going to be my next chapter.
Huh?
Because they represent a group, or a first example of a group.
Like a coven.
Yeah. And you find that into the films of the late 20th century. Not earlier. They start with a single witch, or a single witch composed like that witch, but that's all. It's individual. Samantha has a whole family, but she's basically on her own as a character. The group of witches comes up in Witches of Eastwick, for instance. Comes up in teenage witch films like Craft, in the series Charmed. So that's a very recent phenomenon. I find the most, to me, pleasing the picture of it in Stardust, the basic basis of Neil Gaiman's book. Again, three witches based on Shakespeare, with a little bit of fairy tale witch mixed into that. But that's a very late development within film. So, well, changing it, putting it into the group, and of course use what you already have. Shakespeare is a family.
Was there any direction on his part of how they looked, they were depicted at the time that the play was written?
And Shakespeare?
Yes, yes.
You have to ask a
Shakespeare
historian. Maybe he gave directions. He based his three witches, as far as I know, on a Scottish example. There are three witches, but usually you don't find a description of how witches would have looked. Artists had big trouble, and they, if you look at the paintings at around 1600, you see young witches, old witches, in between, naked, clothes, everything. Because they were just people who were accused of being witches. But it didn't look
Yes, I was really fascinated by your discussion of the domestication of the witch in the films that you were looking at.
Yeah.
And right at the beginning, you noted the dates of the 1960s, and I wonder, do you think there is any sort of connection between this motif of the witch as a sort of dangerous, autonomous, unpredictable woman needing to be controlled? I mean, is that anything to do with the time and the rise of the women's movement and the whole business of sort of keeping women in a safe space? Do you think there's a connection between those?
I think actually Bewitched preceded the second wave of the women's movement. Because that happened at the end of the I speak from a European point of view. So what happened in the end of the 60s was all the protests were very much masculine. And men doing these things. The women's movement only came up at the end of it. Bewitched started in 1964. So it's the other way around, almost. What they did, so the one thing they admitted later, because of all these things about discriminating people, they said there's a big parallel with homosexuals, gay people. So to the makers of the film and to Elizabeth Montgomery, which were equivalent to gays, that was in her mind what she was acting out as a witch. That's in the papers. I didn't invent it myself.
Just touching on what you said just then, I've read in a few places that there's a civil rights subtext that runs throughout Bewitched in 1964.
Yes.
And I've read that putting the program, if you like, in the absurd discourse of witchery, if you like,
Yes.
they're able to explore marginalised groups and that type of thing through the use of witches as opposed to other marginalised minority groups.
Yes. That's what they later said they were doing, but in a very subtle way and not immediately. Because if you look very good, it's not the domestication that comes out of the series. If you look them, I think I'm now somewhere at number 100 or something. Still got a few to go. But yeah, she's doing her housewife stuff, and she says she wants to do it. I have my suspicions actually if she actually wants to do it, or why she wants to do it. But it depicts the struggles that were going on at the time, but much more subtle than, say, Arthur Miller did in the Crucible.
I was just going to say, kind of connecting to what she was just saying, that when it was that episode where we were sort of speaking about the minority, seeing the witches as a minority, and I don't know whether it was just me seeing this, but there was almost sort of like a correlation from what I saw of the drawings of the witches to sort of, in a way, the sort of anti-Semitic caricatures of the Jews with the sort of like extended features and very gruesome. And I just thought it was quite interesting in a way, sort of introducing sort of making people look at minorities in a different sort of light. I just found that quite interesting. I don't know whether that was just me seeing it, but it did sort of, that drawing did look quite similar to some of
I think you may have something there.
No, it's a weird jump, but
No, I remember years ago I had a discussion with Americans about racism who looked at racism in terms of color.
Hmm.
And I said, no, what is important in Europe is look at racism in terms of noses.
Hmm.
So, yes. Well, I'm not sure you can actually make that connection if you look at the actual pictorial history.
It's just one of those weird things.
It's interesting.
Also, about how sort of in fairy tales the witches are seen as being these sort of lonely women out in the woods, don't have anyone. They're all very old and sort of shriveled past their prime, and how in the media and the films there's a lot of with them being quite beautiful and being sort of controlled by the man. And I was just thinking in a lot of sort of mythology and things like that, you have magical women or magical creatures who, once they fall in love with a man or marry a man, lose their powers. And it just sort of, it's kind of
finding him not wanting her to use her magical abilities, whether there's a connection there. Or once again, whether I'm just seeing random things.
The witch in Belbook and Candle is supposed to have lost her abilities once he fell in love. Yeah, so there's certainly that notion around, but you hardly see it. It's the only place I've seen, because in a film, when you depict a witch, you need to depict a woman who can do something. Perform a ritual, use her hands or whatever. You need to have a visible witch, an acting witch. In history, of course, you didn't have that kind of witches. So, again, you wouldn't lose your powers anyway. It is actually.
It was like a suppression, as it were, though, in that case.
Yeah, let's put it this way. You find some fairy tales where, or actually children's stories where this is mentioned. Everyday life, which exactly the other way around. You grow old, you don't function as a woman anymore. So instead of giving life, you take it. That's in very rough terms, a few exceptions, but very basic terms, that's the everyday life which actually uses her womb as a way of bewitching. So there's a lot of things with different bodies in there. But again, that's not taken up in the films because they couldn't do anything with it. They didn't even know anything about it.
Why don't you think black women are represented as witches? Because all the witches that you see are white. So were witches not part of the culture of Africa and Asia, or is it just purely a European phenomenon?
The witches I've looked at are purely European. Well, this is an extremely complicated anthropological problem, where you can actually translate concepts from other cultures that are more or less similar, often less than more, into something that would be a witch. Because what you need to do is to set it against all the other concepts that are in that particular culture. So you create a whole network of different people categories and different action categories. And then you can say, okay, is this similar or not? What's usually done is just take one concept out of context and translate it into witch or sorcerer. But then, again, it's a very difficult issue. You need to invite a few anthropologists to discuss about it because they want to be among themselves.
There's one more question up at the back.
Oh, yes. I want to ask, as you're a writer, how do you portray the witches in your books?
Sorry, have I what with the witches in my book?
Willem isn't do you mean a creative writer?
Yeah.
I don't think, as far as I know, you are a creative writer. I mean, you're a writer who's creative, but you don't.
I'm a historian.
Yes, you're a historian, but do you have a favourite way of someone portraying a witch? Read a story?
No, because I use what I find in archives and in newspapers and little bits of papers folklorists have left everywhere. So, if I would do it in my own writing, I would play with it. So I would go all the directions I'm not allowed to in history.
Any more questions? Can we again show one more question?
Is it right that the term which originally comes from wise woman, and that in
Comes from wise woman. I think we've started something.
It's very simple now, but it is a bit more complicated explanation. You need to look at the constellation. So what you have is, say, a family, just married. Children die, another child dies, cows don't give milk anymore, etc. All kinds of misfortune. They don't know what's happening. Someone tells them, can be a witch who's doing this to you, because they're vulnerable, because they just entered a new stage of life. It's this liminality thing. How do you find out? You go to an expert. That is the person you're meaning.
Yeah, also in terms of...
That's the cunning woman,
Yeah.
the cunning man. She or he is knowledgeable about witchcraft. But at the same time, that's the person who actually makes sure that people are being kept pointing out as witches.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. There is always that person, the person who spent all their life learning about the herbs, learning about the seasons, learning about what's going on around them. When something goes wrong, when the neighbour's cow dies or when the crops fail, that's the person who will be pointed out as the witch.
No. I've looked at as many examples I could find. There's a very small minority of cunning people who are actually accused as witches themselves. More than 90% of all the reasons where people were accused of men and women you find, say, from 15th to the 20th century were not knowledgeable about witchcraft. And the people you find as cunning folk are not accused. So it's separate. And it may, always cautious, say if you go to Italy or to France, it may differ. The situation is known in France where cunning people accuse each other. These are men. One cunning man against another. So, yeah, but I think that's a very late development. Just the message is actually don't automatically assume, but look into it first.
Very good question. Any other questions? Just one.
Just a quick one. I remember when you first started talking about witches, the two images that come to mind first is the classical black cat, but the second one that came to mind is Roald Dahl, sort of the witches with these square feet, the clawed hat and bald heads with wigs. I was wondering where did he draw, is there any actual basis for that in history, or is it something he invented himself?
I think he did. Yeah, so on the top of my head, and I've been watching witchcraft films day after day lately. I haven't seen anything that resembles it. So, he's a very creative writer.
Good one to stop actually on Roald Dahl, which is can we show appreciate again please for a really fascinating talk and a very